Welcome in the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Brennan. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And hey, flying solo here for just a moment. We got Stephen Lassan from Athlon Sports. Deep dive with Stephen. This is the best conversation yet of our weekly appearances this season. We hit on all these games upcoming, thoughts on the upcoming SEC championship, some coaching candidates, Heisman candidates, Coach of the Year, so many topics to discuss with Stephen. We'll get to that in just a second, but hey, leave it to Lane Kiffin on Alabama Week to come up with a new term. You know, Nick Saban gave us the rat poison. That's something that Lane likes to tweet about every 12 hours about the rat poison. But he's got a new one, and apparently he's calling it goat fuel.
Best. You know, I texted Feinbaum on the way over here when I saw him, his quotes like he normally does, and says, you know, the Nick Saban dynasty is over and all that. And every time he says this, which I tell him, all he does is, you know, I call it like goat fuel, opposite of rat poison. You're just like giving the goat fuel, which for him that works, and he goes and proves him wrong every time. So I really appreciate Paul saying that right after the game. So I'm sure that was on his desk Sunday morning.
All right, so I can't wait to hear how many times Kiffin's going to be bringing up the goat fuel this week as Ole Miss looks to get Alabama at home for the first time since, what would it be, 2017? Back in the Hugh Freeze era, Alabama's won the last several in this series. So thank you, Kiffin, for already Monday here, and you're providing content for us on this show, looking ahead to Saturday. So I very much do appreciate that. Real quick here, let's kick it down to Arkansas. Real quick update on KJ Jefferson. Sam Pittman says his quarterback is good to go. Admits he was banged up. Was practicing last week, but not throwing. It's kind of confusing. So maybe they didn't know whether he was going to play last week against Liberty. Maybe that really hurt them with the practice reps. I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm making excuses for Arkansas. There's no excuse for the way they performed against Liberty. They're going to have to play a hell of a lot better with LSU coming to town. Rivalry game, battle for the Golden Boot. Here's the latest on KJ.
On KJ's situation, can he get better in the course of a week, or, you know, what's the, I guess, criteria for how he can go?
Well, I think he feels better this week than he did last week. So I expect him to be able to throw today. And if that's the case, then I feel like he'll be fine by Saturday. You know, I answered a question the other night about, you know, talking to Kendall about KJ. That question was more in reference of what was his health, not necessarily he's not playing well or we're going to take him out. It was about, is he healthy enough to play? And the answer was yes. And so there was never really a thought of pulling him out because of the performance. It was about whether he was healthy or not. And obviously he ended up playing the last quarter. So, got back in groove a little bit, but I just wanted to clear that up because it wasn't about taking him out about performance. It was was he healthy enough?
So a subdued there, Sam Pittman. Hey, he ain't cranking that jukebox, drinking them beers right now. He's trying to get the train back on the tracks with what looks to be their biggest game of the season now. Gotta prevent a 2-game skid heading into another rivalry game with Ole Miss a week out here. So, man, Arkansas is in a tough spot. We're going to talk a lot more Arkansas with Stephen here in just a minute. But one final update before we get to that interview. Texas A&M, Jimbo Fisher, as expected, says Connor Weigman will be our starting quarterback for the Aggies going into this pivotal game.
it. That's
And the
going.
number one guy.
I wish it was. I wish it was all going.
And Weigman, most people wonder about the quarterback. What's his?
No, he's good. They cleared him. He IVs all weekend, took all that stuff, and should be cleared to go today and practice.
With how the season's gone, when you get a loss, is there a certain level of triage that has to be doing, generally speaking, with recruiting?
All the time.
That class.
You keep those relationships close, and like you say, even when recruiting's going well, I mean, recruiting you can be going well, and they'll say, well, them 3 guys are playing. I don't see. I've had that happen. You know, those 2 guys, I thought I'd come in and play. They're doing real well. Where am I going to play? You know what I'm saying? It goes when you're good or you're bad. Recruiting is a never-ending game, no matter whether you're having success or you're having failure or you're having anything in between. That it's ever-changing in today's world, and people, like I say, because of the ability of communication in our world today, you see more of it because of the accessibility to players because of cell phones and social media that people can constantly just be in their ear 24 hours a day. And that's all based off relationship.
So the Aggies need to win out to make a bowl game. Can't do that unless you beat Auburn, an Auburn team you should beat. And on the last episode, we talked about the opening lines. A&M opened as a 2-point favorite against Auburn. Now Auburn's a 2-point favorite in that matchup. So it didn't take long for that to flip towards the Tigers. And speaking of flipping, tough one here for A&M. 5-star linebacker Anthony Hill Jr., the number 1 linebacker prospect in the country, had been committed to Texas A&M since July. He is no longer committed to Jimbo Fisher's program. You got to expect, these type of defections are going to happen when you struggle on the field as much as A&M has struggled. And the only way to ensure, well, I guess it's not really helping too much, but what I was going to say, the only way to ensure winning on the field is talent. Losing arguably the number 1 linebacker prospect in the country sure as hell ain't going to help things. And as Billy Lucci put it, I thought this was a great point. Harold Perkins, LSU, star freshman. Not only is he going to be in all-SEC freshman selection, likely going to be an all-American freshman selection. And hell, he may just be all-American. Harold Perkins, of course, formerly a commit of A&M. So just, you hate to see that for the Aggies. Got to get things cleared up. Otherwise, you're probably going to have more defections, more transfer portal additions there in College Station. But all right, hey, that's enough of me spieling here. Let's kick it over to the latest, greatest interview with Stephen Lassan of Athlon Sports. All right, we're pleased to once again be joined by friend of the show, Stephen Lassan. Of course, you know him at Athlon Stephen on the Twitter machine. And don't forget to subscribe to his outstanding YouTube channel, All CFB 365. Stephen, my friend, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. It's good to be talking with you. I hope you enjoyed the games this weekend, and looking forward to talking about everything coming up. And checks notes, week 11. Already hard to believe it's November and we're winding the season down. So always good to be with you, my friend.
Yeah, and before you know it, Stephen, it'll be Thanksgiving, and football will be, rivalry weekend. But I don't even want to look too far ahead because we got great games upcoming this weekend. And before we look ahead, let's do a little bit of rewind. We don't typically do that, but we just had some colossal matchups in the SEC. Let's start with them Georgia Bulldogs, Stephen. Of course, the true number 1 team in the country. What was your thoughts on Tennessee going down to Athens? Popular pick. I picked them myself. I've had to hear about it all week. They got curb stomped down there by the Georgia Bulldogs. Thoughts on that matchup?
I think probably one of the more impressive victories of the season. I think when you coming into that game, no one had been able to slow down Tennessee's offense, and even a pretty good Alabama's defense. And LSU got punched by Tennessee's offense pretty hard. And for Georgia to just kind of dominate almost from first quarter on, what was really impressive. I think probably the most impressive part of that for Georgia was the way they shut down the passing game. And, Kirby kind of talked about it after the game of, they weren't going to give Tennessee any layups. And you could tell they were the aggressor with the way they played coverage, the way they got after things up front. Jalen Carter made a big difference in that game for Georgia too. Having him back to 100% makes a big difference. in the big picture, Mike, you and I have talked about Georgia all year and wondering if they could flip the switch. They did it against Oregon. They've been a little bit inconsistent, but I think that team that we saw on Saturday, if that's the level they play at for most of the rest of the year, they're going to win the national title again, because I think that's the best team right now in college football, and they proved it on Saturday.
Right. It's hard to imagine Georgia having a letdown in a SEC title game, a playoff game. That's when they really lock it in. So let me ask you, Stephen, just won the national championship, may do it again, may not even lose a game this time around. Is Kirby Smart, in your mind, the best coach in college football, or do they have to? I mean, I guess we're assuming they'll win the title, but maybe they have to do that before you can definitively say that. But as of right now, after smoking Tennessee, do you have Kirby as the best coach in college?
I feel like I'm getting set up to be on Old Takes Exposed here, Mike, or some message board is going to come after the two of us this week. I still think Nick Saban is the GOAT. I just think you look at his track record, the longevity there. I also think, and I hope this isn't too much of a hot take, but I do think Georgia is now the team to beat in the SEC on an annual basis. Not saying the dynasty is over. I think Alabama is going to be just fine going forward, but I think the torch has been somewhat passed to Georgia. You look at what they've done the last 2 years. They beat Alabama in the national championship game, got over the hump, the way that they're recruiting, developing, and dominating like they did on Saturday. I think Georgia's probably the team to beat, obviously this year, but I think even going forward, they're going to get that benefit of the doubt at one, in the preseason, like Alabama did. So maybe the discussion here is, I think if you polled people nationally before the season, who was the second coach in college football behind Nick Saban? And they probably would have said Dabo Swinney. I think I would vote Kirby over Dabo at this point. I think Kirby's ability to adapt more to the environment of college football. I know he made a big deal about the transfer portal at the end of the game, but they've used it in the past and they'll use it again going forward. But what he's built at Georgia, I think he's closed the gap to Alabama, even past them. And then I think you look at national coach rankings. If I had to rank them right now, I would go Saban 1 and Kirby Smart at 2.
And last thing on this one, Stephen, do you think Hendon Hooker cost himself the Heisman on Saturday with a sub? Either you could say he had a subpar performance, or Georgia just forced him into that, or do you still have belief with a month left in the season, provided he plays well down the season here, that Hendon Hooker can still win the Heisman? What's your thoughts on that?
I think he can still win it. I think the bad news is that he and Tennessee didn't play a great game when the spotlight was at its brightest on Saturday. The good news is that he's got a couple games to sort of change the mind of voters who might have soured on him. And it's hard to knock Hendon Hooker too much. Georgia's just, anytime we start talking about the game on Saturday, the first thing that comes to my mind is Georgia was just a better team. And you could see how many dudes they got on defense, what they were able to do at every level. So it's not all Hendon Hooker's fault. The other problem with that is going to be is that Tennessee, the remaining schedule, there's no marquee opportunity the rest of the way. Missouri, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt, the national spotlight's going to be away from him. I think the positive thing, if you're Tennessee, is if you look around at the rest of college football, there's really nobody that's kind of at the top of the Heisman rankings. I think you would get some different opinions. Drake May, the quarterback from North Carolina, Bo Nix, the quarterback from Oregon, is in the discussion as well. I mean, who would have guessed that at the start of the year? Caleb Williams from USC, and probably CJ Stroud of Ohio State. So you throw Hendon Hooker's numbers and what he means to that team, he's absolutely still in discussion for the Heisman Trophy. I don't know if he can win it. I think a strong performance against Georgia probably would have solidified his place. He's still got time to make up, but without that spotlight game, it may be hard to win it. I think if you're a Tennessee fan, I think you really want to root for Michigan to take care of business in the game and make sure that CJ Stroud doesn't have a huge performance, and maybe that helps Hendon Hooker.
Well, one guy, Stephen, you didn't mention there that we may have to put him into that conversation soon is Jaden Daniels, of course, LSU with the huge upset over Alabama. How surprised were you by that outcome? Maybe it wasn't even an upset in your mind, but we sit here Alabama's got 2 losses in the regular season, and who knows, Stephen, a third could be on deck. We'll get to that one in a minute. But thoughts on Alabama losing at LSU?
I was surprised that they lost. Like an idiot, I picked Alabama. I thought the game would be close, though. I think just based upon what we've seen this year, Alabama struggled on the road. LSU had been trending up over the last couple weeks and getting that win over Ole Miss. I think some concerns for me for Alabama kind of go that you came off the off week and that was what the performance that you turned in. It was not what I was expecting. I was expecting to see a much more focused Alabama team, especially with sort of backs against the wall, needing to win out to get to the college football playoff. I think there has to be changes coming for Alabama this offseason. I think OC, DC, staff changes across the board. Bill O'Brien, the production has been fine. I think creativity hasn't necessarily been there on offense. They have a lot of talent at receiver. It's not really being utilized effectively. Bryce Young kind of had an off night. LSU's defense had a lot to do with that. So there are a lot of things I think that we could point to at Alabama that are going wrong. On the other side of things, I think really impressive how LSU has improved from game 1 to this point of the season. You mentioned Jaden Daniels. Just how comfortable and how much better I think he's gotten in this offense. I mean, the knock on him at Arizona State was always going to be accuracy, mid-range, downfield. I mean, look at what he's done the last, what he did against Alabama on Saturday. I mean, the touchdown pass in the corner to, I think it was Taylor, the tight end, was just an unbelievable throw. So he's really one of the driving forces behind this improvement. And I think as a team, whether it's defense, offense, I think they've really started to settle in under Brian Kelly, and Kelly deserves a lot of credit for that too.
Now I'm going to push back, Stephen. I don't like to do this because I respect your opinion, but you just said Alabama dynasty, they ain't dead. Yet here we got Georgia, king of the East, as I'm calling them now. LSU, we've got a competent and hungry coach. We got Ole Miss emerging. If A&M would only fire Jimbo and get a competent coach in there, or hell, if he figures his, all he's really got to do, I kid. All he's really got to do is hire a competent offensive play caller, and A&M can be right there. So how can you sit here and say the dynasty's not dead? Maybe what you mean, I'll let you speak here in a moment, but maybe you're saying Alabama could still win a national championship down the line. They could still win SEC titles, but when I think of Alabama, Stephen, I think of every year they're the pick. Every year they're going to run through everybody, and it's an upset if you beat them. But here for 2 years now, they have looked not elite to me. They've looked like a very, very, very good team, but of course they look beatable, and now they have 2 losses. So I think moving forward, like you said, Georgia's a king. LSU is going to be a thorn in their side. I mean, I think there's Tennessee. Hell, Tennessee just knocked them off. So I don't think I think Alabama has taken a step down. What's your thoughts on that?
I think I would agree with that. I know we're like a week past Halloween, so I was hesitant to even use this reference, but I've always, thought about, like you said before, Alabama's like the Terminator. But like Michael Myers, like he falls off the porch and he's not there and they're looking for him. Like that's Alabama. Like they're going to pop back up again at some point in the future. But I think what you said there is kind of what makes me think that it's going to be harder for Alabama to dominate going forward. Now, saying all that, every time that Nick Saban is challenged, he adapts. He's been very good at changing with the times in college football. We all remember if this is what we want football to be, it was a threat to the rest of college football. They went out and hired Lane Kiffin, Steve Sarkisian, adapted their offense. I'm sure they'll do that going forward. But I think it's also easier in this era of college football to build a roster that gets better quick. If the transfer portal wasn't like it was, I don't know that LSU could have won that game on Saturday night. You look at some of the guys who made plays. Bernard Converse, Wingo played a lot on the defensive line. Brooks and the other Arkansas transfer, the defensive backs were huge in that game. Jaden Daniels, Tennessee's made additions to the portal. Georgia's done it last year. So I think the portal gives teams an opportunity to fill voids quicker. And it also could hurt teams like Alabama because you can't keep the depth around. They want to go somewhere else and play. But the rise of Tennessee, the rise of LSU, there's more threats in the SEC at Alabama, and you combine the ability to reload and build those rosters quicker, I think that's played a role in that too. So I think if over the next 5 years or so, they will still very much be a threat to win the national championship. I just think the terrain is getting harder for them to dominate like they have. One other thing too, and I think you touched on this, where would Alabama be the last 2 years if they didn't have Bryce Young? I mean, look at go back to the 2021 and how important he was to the SEC championship game against Georgia. And this year, we saw what happened when they didn't have him against A&M and what he meant against Tennessee. So it is going to be interesting. It's going to be a really interesting offseason at Alabama as they try to get back to being a national championship contender.
It's not official, Stephen, but following Saturday's results, I mean, it's all but official. Georgia's going to be in the SEC championship game. Barring a collapse, LSU is going to be in a championship game. And when I say that, Stephen, I'm already hearing Ole Miss people, what the hell? We still got a shot. Yeah, you do, but I'm not taking them seriously in that discussion until they beat Alabama, which that's a monumental task in and of itself. So, beat them, we'll talk. But in what's looking to be a very likely matchup of Georgia versus LSU in Atlanta for the SEC championship, what's your early thoughts on that game? And certainly got to assume Georgia's going to be a favored in that game, but what's perhaps a path to LSU pulling an upset?
It's a good question. I think if I had to guess, I would guess Georgia's probably favored by double digits, maybe 10, 12, 14 points in this game. I think if you're LSU, the reason to be optimistic you can hang is kind of what we've seen over the last couple of weeks. They just seem to be getting better. And we know that Georgia, with all the speed and athleticism and the way they play defense, is going to be a real problem for LSU's offensive front. But maybe you can mitigate that with Jaden Daniels and moving around and some of the ways the receivers and all that. I think LSU's also running the ball a little bit better too. Some of that is Jaden Daniels. Some of that is some of the other running backs they have. I think LSU is getting better as a team on both sides of the ball. And I think that would probably be my most optimistic path. And then you also throw in Jaden Daniels. But I think looking down the road, they would probably need a lot to go their way. And that's turnovers, avoiding the mistakes on special teams that we've seen, and finding some ways to basically make it the Jaden Daniels game where he just causes so much problems for Georgia's defense.
So let me ask you this, Stephen. I realize we still got about a month left in the season. Things can change. But right now, who would you give SEC Coach of the Year honors to?
If you would have asked me before Saturday, I think it would have been a slam dunk for Josh Heupel. I think now you have to start putting Brian Kelly in that discussion too. And I think it's kind of for some of the reasons that we talked about. They've gotten so much better since the start of the season. There are 2 losses this year to Florida State by 1. And then, of course, there's that game against Tennessee. And it's also not just where they are this season. It's the collection of roster talent that they've assembled in the offseason and being able to mold it into a team that won the SEC West potentially. If I had to file a ballot today, I would still vote for Josh Heupel as Coach of the Year. I think just beating Alabama, they're still very much in the playoff mix. How far this team has come since he took over, he would get my pick to be SEC Coach of the Year at this point.
Not Jimbo?
Don't think so. I think there's some work to do in College Station, Mike. I mean, in fairness to Jimbo, they were shorthanded this week, so we won't knock them too much. But Jimbo would be pretty far down the list. We'd have to get past BK and Lane Kiffin and Josh Heupel.
Does head-to-head matter in that regard to you with Heupel and Brian Kelly?
That's a good question. I think it probably factors into it. Like if I'm voting on these things like that, like a close discussion like this, like maybe you would look at that. I try to look at it in the total context of the season, like where teams were, where they are now, just the complete picture. So I think the hard part about that is you could make arguments for both coaches in the totality of the argument, and the check mark for the head-to-head would be in Heupel's favor. So I think Heupel at this point would be my favorite, and I suspect that if Tennessee is 11-1 at the end of the year, he would probably win it over Brian Kelly.
What about, do you give any consideration to Kirby and Lane Kiffin for the job he's done in Oxford?
Absolutely. I think One of the problems that Kirby's going to run into is a problem that Ohio State and Alabama coaches tend to run into in coaching awards is they're just expected to be good, and no one's probably going to vote for them for Coach of the Year. But I think an argument in favor of Kirby Smart would be look at what they lost to the NFL draft and look at where they are now and look at what's happened during the season, just getting better week to week and sort of putting it all together as November comes along. So I think an argument for Kirby Smart would be if they put the pedal down the next couple of weeks and dominate, go to Mississippi State, beat Kentucky, take care of business against Georgia Tech, and do the same thing and take control of the LSU game. I mean, it's hard to argue with a coach that would be 13-0 and be dominant for most of the season after losing all that talent to the NFL draft.
Now, speaking of coaches, Stephen, before we started recording here off air, we were talking about South Florida. Their job just opened up. They fired Jeff Scott, the former Clemson offensive coordinator, I believe, and just, at the top of your head, any SEC candidates? Clearly, they're not. No head coach is going to leave the SEC to go down there, but maybe some assistants that could fit into that head coaching search again at South Florida.
I was going to make the joke that, hey, West Virginia could be open in the future, and Jimbo Fisher maybe wants to go home to finish his coaching career.
I forgot all about that. Yeah, hell, he said that just a couple months ago, didn't he?
Right. Hey, maybe he was foreshadowing to the end of this season. So, the South Florida job, I think, first of all, it's a pretty good group of five job. And I think it'll probably attract some head coaches, not SEC head coaches, but coordinators, people like maybe a Kendall Briles at Arkansas, maybe a Todd Monken at Georgia. I wouldn't be surprised if their name came up here. Don't know if they'd necessarily take the job. I think Dan Mullen, the former Florida coach, could be interesting. He's got ties to the state of Florida. He's on ESPN now. Maybe does he want to go back to P5 or G5? So a few names to watch, I think, but who knows? It's a tough job in comparing like G5 head coach to being a solid coordinator in the SEC.
Right. Well, Stephen, let's look ahead to the upcoming weekend in the SEC. Not, the huge, colossal showdowns we had last week, but every matchup is an SEC matchup. And usually, Stephen, these are the weekends when you kind of look at it and say, there's no game I must watch. It's usually when we get about 6 upsets and some of the best football alive here. So we got Alabama. Let's start with this one. Going on the road, of course, coming off a loss at Ole Miss. Ole Miss has had 2 weeks to prepare. And I know they got blown out of the water last season in Tuscaloosa, but the year prior, that was the 2020 Alabama that won the national championship, and Ole Miss went punch for punch. They just couldn't stop them. So, this could be a very, very entertaining game. What's your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, is Lane Kiffin going to replicate the get your popcorn ready and throw the headset off before this one? I think a big question going into this game is, where is the sort of emotional level for Alabama? I mean, they're pretty much out of the SEC West mix. They're pretty much out of the playoff. A lot would have to break their way in order to get back in it. It'd be a pretty heavy lift. So I think it's fair to wonder, emotionally where Alabama is. And not to mention, they've had a lot of trouble on the road the last 2 years. So here they are. Everything is, they have a lot to play for, but not as much as they did a week ago. And they're going on the road where they've struggled. And Ole Miss has had 2 weeks to get ready. Like you mentioned, I love the setup here for Ole Miss. I think that they can certainly make this game interesting. The big question, I think, will be, if you're Alabama, can you stop Zach Evans? Can you stop Judkins? Can you force this game on Jackson Dart's shoulders? And I think with 2 weeks to get ready, I think Lane Kiffin will have some things to throw at Alabama. I think Alabama's offense should be able to move the ball in Ole Miss defense based upon what we've seen out of Ole Miss the last couple games. Now, they had some injuries. The off week came at a good time, but when you get Lane Kiffin, Nick Saban, and you get the setup for this game, I think there's a lot of reason to think that Ole Miss can keep this a lot closer maybe than the sports books out in Vegas think.
Yeah, and you hit on something interesting there, Stephen. Of course, Nick Saban is the greatest college coach of all time. I don't even think that's debatable at this point. But he had some interesting comments, basically challenging his team, that we should win this game. If we do what we, if we are who we are, we should just win this game. He didn't quite say it quite like that, but is there a lot on the line, do you think, for Nick Saban moving forward? If he were to drop his game, and if he can't, there's talks of NILs hurting Alabama. The portal is hurting Alabama. It's kind of a me mentality with some of those players. I'm not saying all of them, certainly, but you think there's a lot on the line where if they lose this game, like you said, what do they have to play for? And maybe Saban's sitting here saying, have I lost it, or have I lost this team? I don't know. I'm kind of rambling here, but what thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a fair point. I think just the emotional kind of landscape of Alabama is going to be really interesting on Saturday and going forward, because even if they finish with 10 wins and they go to a New Year's Six bowl game, I mean, I would bet that probably Bryce Young and Will Anderson are considering, you have to, these top players like we've seen, it's going to be a weird end to the year. So I think it's important, if you're Alabama and you want to finish on a high note, to be able to go out there and take care of business against Ole Miss. And so if you drop a game to Ole Miss, and then at the end of the year, you finish 9-3, it would probably be one of the more, disappointing teams in the SEC recently. They were picked number one pretty much by everybody, considered the overwhelming favorite to win it all. So I think there's plenty of motivation to end the year on a high note. The thing that I keep coming back to is Saturday's game was emotional, high stakes, physical, 60 minutes on the road, and they've just not been able to kind of rally on the road in these tough spots. So I'm curious to see how well Alabama plays. I think there's one of two ways this game could go. It could be Alabama puts the pedal down and they cover the spread, and we're talking that Saban's got everything back under control and they're going to finish the year on a high note, or Kiffin goes out there and pulls off the upset, which wouldn't surprise me either at this point.
Yeah, we're giving him that goat fuel, as Lane Kiffin calls it. Let me ask you for the Ole Miss side, Stephen. You kind of hit on this, but with Will Anderson, Dallas Turner, all these, the cheetah package, they like to call it down there. I don't know that, Ole Miss can just line up and run over these guys, but it seems to serve them well that, you don't want Jackson Dart sitting back there all day facing these monsters, because they'll get them. But if you're Ole Miss, if you can ground and pound, you have success on the ground, which that's what your program's built on now. I don't want to say the matchup favors them, but that's how you take someone out of their cheetah package is just run right at them, don't you think?
I agree with you. Yeah, I think that's probably the most fascinating on-field matchup about this game is the Ole Miss rushing attack and offensive line, which has not given up many sacks this year, and Jackson Dart's mobility against that Alabama front, which has been pretty good against the run this year. I think that's going to decide whether or not Ole Miss can pull off the upset. If they have success on early downs, and I think you're talking, staying out of like 2nd and 9, staying out of 3rd and 8, like obvious passing situations. If you can do that and you can maybe pop a big play with Evans or Judkins, and Jackson Dart's moving around out of the pocket, making some plays with his legs, Ole Miss is going to have a chance to make this much, much more interesting than the spread would indicate. I think the problem spot would be, if you're Ole Miss, you don't want to get into a situation where you're playing from behind and having to drop back 40 times and asking Jackson Dart to make those throws. You need that running game, and you need his escapability to keep this one close.
Now, how about this one, Stephen? Down here battling for the boot, LSU at Arkansas. Arkansas won last season in Baton Rouge. Obviously, a much different team, different coaching staff and everything. But how surprised were you when the line opened? I don't know if it's still at -2, but that's what it opened at. LSU Tigers on the road, favored by 2 after Arkansas just blew a game, favored by 2 touchdowns at home against Liberty. Was that surprising to you?
I think a lot of things were surprising. I think Arkansas losing to Liberty was really surprising to me. Alarming that Arkansas got outplayed at the line of scrimmage. If there was one thing you could count on from this team, was they were going to run the ball, and they had probably one of the SEC's better offensive lines, and Liberty gave them so much trouble on Saturday. And of course, I think there was some doubt about how healthy KJ Jefferson was. So there are some reasons, I guess, you could look at how Arkansas struggled. But I think looking forward to this game, it's not really surprising to me that that spread is probably 2 or 3 points. Like you mentioned, I think it's a question of LSU coming off the win in a tough spot, now having to get refocused and go on the road to play Arkansas. This series, of course, has been crazy at times. It's been dominated recently by LSU. Arkansas won last year, like you mentioned. So I know it's maybe not high profile and it's lost a little bit of steam because Arkansas lost last week, but I think there's plenty of intrigue here. I think if you're Arkansas, you ought to be hungry to go out and sort of, get the bad feelings away from last week, and you got a chance to spoil LSU season to some extent and make them go into College Station needing a win to get to the SEC West title game. So I suspect we will see a pretty good effort out of Arkansas. I'd be surprised if they come out flat in this one.
Well, they've come out flat on a couple, but none of them as rivalry games or anything like that. So I did want to ask you, Stephen, are you concerned at all at the direction of Sam Pittman's program? I mean, again, we've talked about it at length. They've got a gauntlet of a schedule, and hell, had they won at Liberty, I probably would have picked them to win against. Well, now that we see LSU, I don't know if I would have picked them, but I would have had a lot more confidence going into this matchup. And now all of a sudden, maybe this is just what we do in the SEC, Stephen. We lose a game we shouldn't lose. We got to fire everybody. But what's your level of concern, if at all, that we are trending in the wrong direction here in Fayetteville?
Speaking of overreacting, how are those Brian Kelly should be fired posts from the season opener after losing to Florida State, man? Those things didn't age well at all. But I think to your question about Arkansas, I'm not worried yet. I want to see how Arkansas finishes this season. This game, they're going to be an underdog. They still have to play Ole Miss. They still have to go play at Missouri in the season finale. Missouri's probably playing for bowl eligibility in that game, in the last game of the year for those two teams. So I would like to see Arkansas. I know you mentioned the slow starts. I mean, Missouri State sticks out. Liberty sticks out to me as games they started slow and really had no business doing so. They should have won both of those games. It's pretty rare to see a double-digit underdog go into Fayetteville and win a game like that, or really anywhere in the SEC. So I guess to answer your question is, I think there are reasons to be concerned a little bit, but also I think going forward, if they finish this year on a high note, I think all of this discussion changes and we're probably putting Arkansas back in the top 25 to start next season. Do think they will have to be very active in the portal to fix some of the things, whether that's secondary, finding more playmakers at receiver, restocking some of the positions that they're gonna lose. I still believe in Sam Pittman and believe in these coordinators, but I think these next couple games will give us a better answer to that question.
Now, is it safe to say, Stephen, like you said, they got 3 conference games remaining, home for LSU, home Ole Miss, on the road Missouri. They can win all those games, but hell, if they play like they did on Saturday, they could lose them all. So do you agree with that? And does that kind of make their end of the season fascinating to watch?
100%. I feel like an idiot because we talked a week ago or two ago, like how optimistic I was about Arkansas finishing the year on a high note, and here I am after losing to Liberty trying to piece this back together. But I do think that's what makes Arkansas interesting down the stretches. I literally have no idea what to make of this team in those 3 games, because they could win all 3, they could lose all 3. And that sort of kind of gets to your question of, where is this program going into 2023 in the concern level? If they come out and they win all these games, or they go 2-1, I think you feel a lot better. I think if they go 0-3, I think you get really worried going into next season. So their schedule is really unlike any in this mix. I mean, they're all toss-up games, and you could make a case for Arkansas to win all those or to lose them. They also have the great timing. I mean, playing Ole Miss before they play Mississippi State on a short week is great for timing. So Arkansas really needs to get one of these SEC games for sure, and then get Missouri in the season finale and at least get to 7-5.
Speaking of the last one, though, let me ask you this real quick, Stephen. Hugh Freeze, did he just land him the Auburn job? I mean, as much as I hate that guy, if you look past all his BS, which is difficult to do, but if he wins, he's a winner. You know, he that's all he does. He wins. He gets quarterbacks. It's fun offense. How can you argue against it if you're Auburn?
I think that's the case, Mike. I think if you start making a list of candidates to take over at Auburn, you know, we talked about it last week that Lane Kiffin and Hugh Freeze really fit what they need. Someone who's got a track record of offense, recruiting in the SEC, knows how to use the portal. All of those things fit both of those coaches. I certainly don't think it hurts Hugh Freeze's candidacy that they went into Fayetteville and won. Whether or not it gets in the job, I think is the bigger question. You know, depending on who you read or you listen to, you know, whether he's 1 or 3 or 5 on the list of candidates, I would guess he's very high on the list. And whether or not they won on Saturday probably wouldn't have hurt or helped. But I think he's probably going to be one of the first names that Auburn talks to in this coaching search. And that's just my opinion, no insight on it.
And he's a known cheater. He's perfect for Auburn. Okay, let me ask this, Stevens. Georgia at Mississippi State. Now, of course, Alabama has dominated Mississippi State, and Georgia runs essentially the same defense. Do you think that serves Kirby and company well in this matchup, or is that not a factor in your opinion?
I think, well, the first thing I was going to say was, you know, these two teams have played only 2 times since 2012, and Georgia hasn't been to Starkville since 2010.
Dang.
I was just going to bring that up because I wanted to mention that the SEC should play 9 conference games again. But to answer your question specifically, I think this game is really all about one thing, and that is if Georgia shows up motivated, ready to play, they'll win easily. If they're sort of having the post-Tennessee hangover and they have trouble getting to focus, you know, Starkville's a difficult place to play. Mike Leach's offense can give you some problems, and it's a little different challenge than playing Tennessee. They will take the shorter chunk plays as opposed to Tennessee looking for more of those deep shots. So it is a little bit different to prepare for, but I think we just watched Georgia dominate Tennessee, and now you look at Mississippi State, and even though they're good on offense, they're not as good as Tennessee, and that would give me a lot of optimism if I'm Georgia. I just wonder about motivation and focus level a week after dominating Tennessee.
Yeah. Well, yeah, now that you mention it, Stephen, it makes me wonder. I know Starkville's maybe not a destination for a lot of people, but hell, maybe these Bulldogs, because a lot of them never been down there. Maybe they invade the stadium. That'll be interesting to see. Any concern from you that Mike Leach, I mean, he's kind of like all over the place, inconsistent. Hell, had they lost that game to Auburn, I mean, that was like a must-win, I felt, for him. They could lose the Egg Bowl, would be 3 in a row, could get embarrassed here on Saturday. I mean, I don't know how you keep a guy if he's losing all these damn games, but thankfully he won the Auburn game. Hopefully, for Mississippi State's sake, he makes it competitive here on Saturday. What's your feelings on the job Mike Leach is doing at Starkville?
I think, Mike, you and I have talked about this earlier this year, and I think it's fair to probably say that Mississippi State, and we'll see where the season ends up, but I think they kind of missed an opportunity here. LSU was in rebuild mode. Ole Miss had a ton of transfers, and you wondered how that would fit together at the start of the season. Of course, A&M is maybe going to be 6-6, 5-7 at the end of the year. I think they really missed an opportunity with the way that things are kind of in flux in the West, combined with a pretty veteran roster. And I think going forward into next year, obviously recruiting for Mike Leach is going to be important. And I think having Will Rogers for another season, can they take that offense to the next level? So I think certainly there's probably some frustration there if you're a Mississippi State fan. And I think missed opportunities would probably be the theme for me, because I think they had the talent and they had the uncertainty in the West to sort of take advantage of that this year.
How about this matchup, Stephen? Missouri at Tennessee. And before we even get to the game, man, I know we caution, let's not fire everybody. Let's not get rid of Drinkwitz and all this. I was fully on board with that. And I'm not saying we fire him now, but contract extension. What? I think he's 15 and 17 overall. Again, I'm not sitting here saying he's a bad coach, but I'm trying to justify why we're giving him an extension. And hell, he turned around and it was embarrassing his offense. I feel like we talk about Jimbo needs a coordinator. I feel like Drake needs him an offensive coordinator. What's your thoughts on Missouri extending Drink's contract?
So 2 coaches at Missouri got a contract extension last week, and one probably was more deserving than the other, and that was Blake Baker, because his defense has been great this year. I think maybe the biggest surprise in the SEC is Blake Baker taking Missouri's defense into being one of the best in the SEC. I think on Drinkwitz, I think I will be very interested what happens this offseason. I think the extension is probably more about recruiting and trying to ensure that there's no questions necessarily for 2023, 2024. I think that Missouri will probably need to be very active in the portal because they've got to find some difference makers at quarterback, offensive line. They've got to fix it. If it's not somebody in the portal, it's got to be Sam Horn because they fixed, I think, the defense for right now. And so I think it's incumbent on Drinkowitz to either find the right pieces on offense or turn it over to let someone else call the plays next year. So there are a lot of questions for me about Missouri. Saying all that, they could fight their way into being a 6-win team and go to a bowl game this year. So it's not all bad at Missouri, but I think going forward, I think solving the O-line is really at the top of the priority list.
And now as for this matchup this weekend, Stephen, now I know Drink's not been a head coach for terribly long, but losing to Tennessee, that was the most lopsided loss he had ever suffered. Now, maybe this is the most underrated matchup in the SEC this weekend. Tennessee's offense against Missouri's defense should be a great one to watch. How do you think those units match up against one another?
It's a great matchup because I think I'm curious to see if Missouri, like they did against Georgia, can just cause some havoc at the line of scrimmage. What can they throw at Tennessee and Hendon Hooker to try and slow this offense down? That's really their best chance of winning is can your defense slow down Tennessee enough? And then on the other side of the ball, can you use that short passing game to sort of control the time of possession and keep Tennessee off the field? So that's really what it all kind of boils down to. And to me, I mean, the spread is 21 points in favor of Tennessee. If Tennessee shows up and they're motivated, I think they're probably pretty angry after the Georgia game. I think there's probably a chance that this one gets up to the spread here. It's really Missouri is going to have to find a way to slow down Tennessee, and it starts up front and trying to get some negative plays, getting some pressure on Hendon Hooker, and I'm not sure they can do that for all 4 quarters.
Yeah, and again, this offense, Stephen, I don't know why, but I get maybe no confidence in the offensive line, but they're just terrified to push the ball 10 yards down the field. It's dunk and screen and on and on, a jet sweep over and over and over to death. Brady Cook, I mean, someone asked me earlier, if they had I don't like to pile on guys, but if they had a competent offense, let's put it that way, hell, this is probably a team with a winning record and one of the biggest surprises in the SEC. Do you think they put up a fight at all? And maybe I'll ask it this way. They went into South Carolina and they pulled the upset, and that was a rowdy environment, not necessarily comparing South Carolina and Tennessee's football teams because that's 2 different teams, but confidence level that maybe Missouri and Brady Cook can play better than they have been and maybe make us a competitive ball game.
Probably going to be a pretty heavy lift. I was going to say is
so that's a no.
did Tennessee and South Carolina change play callers for this weekend, and I missed the memo?
No, they did not.
I think to your point on Missouri's offense, Dominic Lovett and Luther Burden, 2 of the better receivers in the SEC as far as talent, production. Now they've got to find more ways to get them the ball. They're going to have to hit a few big plays. I mean, I think they can use that short control passing game, and you're going to need to control kind of time possession to keep Tennessee off the field. Probably Missouri's defense can probably win a few battles here. I just think it's asking a lot to go into Knoxville, Tennessee coming off a loss, plenty of motivation, and comparing that South Carolina game, South Carolina's offense has struggled. Tennessee has the potential to score pretty much every time they touch the ball. So it's a much more heavy lift for Missouri.
All right. Well, speaking of South Carolina, they go to Florida, Stephen. Now they knocked off Florida last season, and it was I think it was like 40-6, if I recall. Of course, different coaching staff, completely different ball game. So that means little to nothing in this matchup. In a swamp, Florida got some nice confidence. Maybe you could argue maybe the biggest win of the Billy Napier era. I guess you could haggle with that. That Utah game was pretty awesome too. But South Carolina, a 9-point underdog, at least at opening. That may have changed, but South Carolina, they do play a little bit better in this underdog role. How do you see this matchup playing out?
Yeah, they really do, Mike. I think if you're just kind of looking at this game from a big picture view, I think the question is going to be whether or not South Carolina can stop what Florida's doing on the ground. South Carolina is giving up around 187 yards in SEC play this year on the ground. So we saw what Florida did to A&M and what they've been able to do for most of the season with Montrell Johnson and ETN and Anthony Richardson chipping in as well. I think it's going to be a heavy lift for South Carolina to slow them down. And then on the other side of the ball, I think if you're South Carolina, the optimism is, they had one of their better offensive performances probably of the season. The problem is it was Vanderbilt, and I don't know there's a whole lot that we could take away from that. Now, if they go to Florida and Florida's defense has struggled, maybe they've got something for the next couple games. It's one of those matchups that on paper I'm kind of looking at it going, I know South Carolina's played well in the underdog role, but I mean, Florida, 7, 8, 9 points might not be enough if they can pick up where they left off against A&M. Also, watching Florida the last 2 weeks against Georgia and A&M, I thought Anthony Richardson's played pretty well the last 2 games. I know maybe he missed some throws against Georgia, but I thought that throw that he made in the end zone to Frazier's against Texas A&M was a really nice throw. So maybe over these next couple games, we'll get a better idea of his development. But I think you have to be maybe a little bit more optimistic if you're Florida.
Yeah, and Anthony Richardson also had the 60-yard touchdown. He had a 3rd and 9 in the red zone touchdown. He was getting pressured. Really good ball. I believe, Stephen, I could be wrong, but I think it's 3 games in a row, no interceptions for Anthony Richardson. That's what you want to see, that progression. I know well chronicled. You're not alone in this, but not a fan of Marcus Satterfield. But if perhaps South Carolina gets that ball rolling, and Spencer Rattler certainly had his best game as a Gamecock, I thought, against Vanderbilt. Again, maybe it's a little caveat because Vanderbilt's defense is so dreadful. But maybe we get some momentum there, and could you at least see the path to where if Spencer does it again, if Anthony Richardson continues his strong play, maybe we're in for a really entertaining, high-scoring shootout-style game.
For sure. Yeah, I think I didn't mean to rain on South Carolina's offensive performance last week. It's just that you have to caveat everything that they were playing the worst defense in the SEC. So I will be interested to see if they can build off of that in a tough environment. Florida's not been great on defense all year either, so it's a little bit hard to read. But I think that, we saw on Saturday against Vanderbilt, Jaheim Bell got involved. There was the big passing play, Joyner. I would like to see South Carolina use some of these guys more often because they've probably been underutilized more this season.
They were saving them for Vandy.
Right. Saving for Vandy. This Florida game would be a good game to empty out the playbook if you have anything, if you're Marcus Satterfield, using Joyner more at quarterback, whatever it is. But yeah, I mean, I think based upon the way Florida has played defense this year, if South Carolina builds on what they did last week and Marshawn Lloyd coming back potentially, I think I could see this game being kind of a fun back and forth, high scoring game.
Now, how about this one, Stephen? It's tough to get a read on, but A&M at Auburn. Of course, I didn't know A&M was going to be down 20 players with the flu last week. Well, hopefully all those guys are back, but how does that mix with, continuity? And I know Haynes King, he was not perfect. Certainly the second half struggled, but a lot of that on his offensive line. So I assume Connor Weigman, if he's healthy, good to go here. But how do you see this one playing out? A&M at Auburn. Auburn certainly has not given up. They could have given up about 3 different ways there against Mississippi State, yet they nearly dominated that second half and stole one from Mississippi State. How do you see this one?
I have no idea what to expect out of either team in this game. I mean, it is this one. It might be the wildest game of the SEC weekend. I mean, if you told me this was like a 45-40 game where there were 3 touchdowns in the final 3 minutes of the game, I would not be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if you told me it was 13-10 and both teams had trouble moving the ball consistently. I think you're right about Weigman. I think if he's healthy, he's in the lineup. It's hard to fault A&M too much for what happened against Florida. They were just down so many guys. I mean, defense, offense, pretty much everywhere. I think that what I'm watching for over A&M's next couple games is just offensive progression by Weigman, seeing how this group can come together, what type of production they can get. It's interesting, the last 2 games they've played, they've come out strong against Ole Miss and Florida, but they've really tailed off after that. So I would be interested to see if the same thing happens again on the road. If you're Auburn, I think the good news is they haven't packed it in for the year. I mean, they could have packed it in 3 weeks ago. They could have packed it in the first half when they were down, I think 24-3. Robbie Ashford was really inaccurate on Saturday, but they found some ways with field position and using Tank Bigsby. Both of these teams have had a ton of issues against the run. So I would expect we see a big game from A-Chain, and it should be a game where Auburn can give it to Tank Bigsby, 25, 30 times and have success against A&M. But this one is the wild card bowl of the weekend in the SEC.
So I assume you're not leaning one way or another at this. I never asked you to pick a game this early, but I was just curious because hell, when the line opened, Stephen, it was A&M -2. I think it's Auburn -2 now. So that gives you an idea. I mean, no one's got faith in A&M to do anything right now. And I'll tell you, I mean, I never make picks this early either, but I'm picking Auburn because I got no faith in A&M. Now, that they certainly should win. They could win. And the fact I'm saying Auburn's going to win, I basically guaranteed A&M's going to win. But do you have a lean at all, or are you still just kind of have no idea at this point in time?
My early lean would probably be Auburn. I think for 2 reasons. I think number one, just being at home. And I think we saw this on Saturday. I mean, the Auburn hasn't packed it in like we talked about, but this team is going to play hard for Cadillac Williams, and he will have them emotionally ready to go for this game. And, A&M just being inconsistent. And if you look at the matchups, I think they favor A&M. But I think seeing what we saw out of Cadillac and Auburn on Saturday, I know maybe from a personnel standpoint, the matchup standpoint, I think they're probably outmanned there. But I think that at home, they can find a way to scratch out an SEC win over A&M for sure.
Okay, final one here, Stephen. Vanderbilt at Kentucky. And, man, Vanderbilt, I don't want to say they squandered an opportunity, but they certainly had their chances against South Carolina, while Kentucky, my God, Stephen, I mean, you screw up royally and it ends up winning you the game. There was a lot of questionable things in that Missouri game. We got to give them credit. They think I hate them already, but they did win the football game. Here's another opportunity to gain some momentum heading into an epic showdown with Georgia. How do you see this one playing out? Does Vanderbilt have any shot at getting their first SEC win in 3 years?
I think it's going to be tough. You look at the series, Kentucky's won 6 in a row over Vanderbilt. 3 of those have been by 1 score. So they have played Kentucky relatively close. I think to your kind of first point there, I think not necessarily that Vanderbilt squandered an opportunity, but I thought they would play a little bit better with South Carolina at home, a chance to kind of get that first SEC win under Clark Lee. In Lexington, I know it may not be pretty for Kentucky, but I think they'll find a way to win this game. In a matchup like this with Vanderbilt's defense and what Will Levis and those playmakers on the outside, you add Kentucky's defense in that too. The deck is really stacked against Vanderbilt in this game. I think it's going to be hard for them to go up to Lexington and get the victory if they couldn't beat South Carolina at home on Saturday.
Any concern? I mean, I guess we've been saying it all season, Stephen, but the offensive line, I mean, they're getting Will Levis killed. And this was Missouri and Tennessee. I'm thinking of maybe it's just, Tennessee, not that they're a great defense, but they do have a really good defensive line. Missouri, obviously a good defense, but man, they were getting after them. Different personnel for Vanderbilt, so maybe that's not a big a concern. But is that a concern at all going into this matchup?
I think it has to be, just because Kentucky's offensive line has just played so poorly all year that, with Clark Lee and some of the background he's got on defense, maybe they can find a way to scheme up something that gives Kentucky a lot of trouble. That's probably the best path that Vanderbilt has to win in this game. Can you create enough negative plays? Can you maybe get to Levis? Can you create a turnover or two in this game? Because I'm just not sure in the other matchups really give Vanderbilt a lot of optimism to win on Saturday. So I think keeping Will Levis healthy and figuring out something on the offensive line, because it just dawned on me that Kentucky gets to play Georgia next week. So I think it's important to keep Will Levis healthy, because they're really going to need him in that offensive line to play better against Georgia next week.
All right, Stephen, I can't thank you enough for joining the show once again. Before you go, can you tell the fine folks where to find all your outstanding work?
Absolutely. You can read my work over at athlonsports.com. You can follow me on Twitter at athlonsteven, and you can check out my YouTube page, all CFB 365, and open invitation to anyone who wants to swing by Mondays at 11 a.m. Eastern time. We do a Twitter space. We talk SEC. We talk all conferences. So I would love to have anyone stop by, ask some questions, and talk everything college football.
All right, so just want to say thanks again, Stephen, for joining the show. I hope everybody appreciated that one. Cousin Shane will be back on the next episode. I always hear from fans who say, well, it's not as good without Cousin Shane. Well, we got to give that Tennessee homer some time after the Vols lost. That man's got a full-time job. He's got a family to support. So give us a little bit of a break here. Cousin Shane's working double time here to provide the content, and I do appreciate each and every one of you sticking it out with us throughout the season. Got about a month left before we get into transfer portal and recruiting and all that, but let's savor this final month of the season while we got it. Before you know it, it'll be February, March. We're going to be dying for some college football. So each and every one of these games is going to count. We got 7 SEC matchups this Saturday. Again, savor each and every one of those, because it won't be long. We'll be dying for a slate like this. But that's going to do it for this episode of the show. We'll catch you on the next one.